Was that a scream?
That's a good question. Does that sound familiar?
Very.
Every single one of these people who witnessed this event, all independently, came to the same conclusion and called me seeking pastoral counsel, asking me what happened.
I was like, do you think a demon or something could have came out of her?
She yelled like a scream.
You hear anything like that ever before?
Yes, I have.
You guys had mentioned that you were talking about possibly this going back earlier than Kristen.
Oh yeah.
Huge. Never seen a bird this big, and it was black. And when it went over the trees, you could see the trees moving from the wind. And this thing just glided right over top of those trees.
You ever see any unusually large birds?
That's so crazy.
There's actually a lot of connections to Logan, West Virginia with Point Pleasant, West Virginia. In 1982, you start getting a lot of UFO sightings in the area, and then you start getting them in Logan, Chapmanville, here in town, and so it just a lot of weird stuff in the area.
You ever see anything weird on your property?
Oh my gosh, it's funny that you asked that.
Listen, whatever this is, it has been pretty much following us for a long time.
From time to time, I do see footprints, and I have no idea where they come from.
This may be the same being that, maybe the natives were dealing with.
In every horror movie, there's a point where the protagonists figure out what the thing is that they're fighting.
This is that.
So that is what? Its resting place? Where I lived while I was a child?
I think we're recording now. Or it still says starting. Okay, there we go. All right. So I am here with the director, producer of an upcoming movie, Dark Holler. I will put the trailer in at the beginning, so people have some context for what your film is, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You want to introduce yourself and let us know, since assuming I put the trailer in correctly, they have a taste for what the film is, and you just want to kind of introduce the film, and then we'll start chatting.
Sure. So my name's Ward Hiney. I have worked on various documentaries and different subjects over the years for different outlets. The Blaze. We had an independent documentary film company for a while, and so Dark Holler is a docuseries. It'll be 6 parts, I believe, following a family in southern West Virginia who has been, it seems like, has been followed by a particular spiritual entity for a few generations. And it's just about our discovery of that. So I came to find out about the story. A friend of mine was a minister, church planner in southern West Virginia, in the Logan area. And I had been, I think like a lot of people in 2020, I had kind of been trying to figure out, I don't know, I think 2020 changed the threshold for what was crazy for people.
Right.
So I think, I was trying to figure that stuff out. I came across a number of pieces of media that made me sort of question my kind of assumed treatment of the paranormal, and all of that is just...
What's your faith background, just for context?
So yeah, I grew up in like the Bible church movement, so like non-denominational Baptist light, and then it's a long story, but we became Reformed. We're in PCA now, And
Okay, yeah, I'm PCA too.
Oh, really? Okay. So, yeah, that was my faith background, I guess, but never, very. I assumed probably 85-90% of the paranormal, supernatural reported stuff, including cryptids, UFOs, all of it,
What's a cryptid for? I don't think I've ever defined that on the channel.
Yeah, so cryptids are, Bigfoot, Loch Ness, devil dogs, basically
like monsters, sort of thing.
Yeah, cryptozoology is the study of undiscovered
crypto.
species.
Okay, yeah, gotcha. Yeah, cryptozoology. Gotcha. Okay.
So anyway, I had just sort of assumed, most of that was crazy, and I kind of had a bin for everything that was crazy that I could easily put things in. And in any case, I had begun, seeing some stuff from Ray Bichet and others that made me start to question that.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of the culmination of that was when I saw the docuseries Hellier about some high strangeness starting in eastern Kentucky, but touching on some stuff in the area I grew up in, West Virginia. And I was pretty intrigued by it, and I knew that my friend had planted a church down there about an hour away from where that series was set. And I had just sort of started asking him, what do you think about the paranormal? Have you ever seen anything or experienced anything? I know you're down there in this area. And he described to me how he had come to believe that he had conducted an exorcism 2 or 3 weeks prior to our having that conversation. And so I had just built out a little freelance kit for myself to shoot, freelance video gigs. And I thought this will be an interesting, little thing maybe for YouTube or for his church's website or something. And so I went down and interviewed the girl, and that was kind of the jumping off point for everything that followed, I guess.
Okay. Was this the same person who was interviewed on was it Cultish or
Yes.
that podcast?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah. Yeah, so when I first came to, I grew up nominally Roman Catholic, and then I became Pentecostal, and then kind of reformed, and eventually made my way to PCA. So I probably at some point I had an overreaction to my Pentecostal upbringing, but as more and more stuff comes in lately, you kind of feel like you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater sort of stuff. And that, you don't want to overcorrect for things that were overemphasized in the past. And I started reading, I had read Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men by Hugh Ross and Ken Samples a long time ago. Or been familiar with it, so I decided to read the book, and I had a discussion with it with A.D. Robles, if you know who he is, and about some UFO stuff. And then just after that, I started reading more and more, some John Keel, some Jacques Vallée, because I knew the UFO stuff was going to get bigger and bigger. And then it starts taking you down a rabbit trail where all these things are interconnected, and basically because they're spiritual entities who, there's a common link and stuff like that. So it sounds like your path was kind of, I guess you heard about this stuff. I didn't know what your background is and kind of what are your thoughts on how you expanded into it? Was it just kind of gradual, or was it just kind of for me, it wasn't you believe in the supernatural by default, but on a day-to-day basis, you almost, except for maybe your prayer life and stuff, you almost have a de facto materialism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we've been using, early on, we began using the phrase functional materialist. So in the way that you function daily, you sort of view the world as a mechanistic relationship of cause and effect, and where the causes are kind of laid out there for you, right on the table.
Right. Where I think it sounds crazy to a certain amount of people. I try to, especially to some non-Christian friends and family or whatever, mention like what I was researching, and it's just like so beyond the categories they have. Like space aliens for UFOs sounds more plausible than interdimensional beings, because they're not functioning. And I find a lot of UFO skeptics, they understand that aliens from another part of the universe isn't really that plausible, but because they only function in materialist categories, they're going with stuff that discounts any like eyewitness evidence at all or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's why Keel and Valet, and I mean, that's why they're as fascinating as they are, is they're essentially saying, I mean, Keel went pretty far in attributing like all supernatural appearances to these ultra-terrestrials and kind of put them all in the same plane, but I think his contention that it's all a unified thing, we're all talking about the same kind of thing, different manifestations of it, is pretty accurate.
I believe so too.
Yeah. And the other I mean, when you start to look at like from the Christian worldview, the scriptural case for what could be meant by B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, in Genesis 6 and Job 38 and Psalm 2, then you're kind of, I mean, we're PCA. So John Calvin's take on this, all the reformers' take on this, is the Augustinian take, where all these references to sons of God are either the rulers of Israel or, tribal warlords. But that falls apart pretty quick when you see in Job, I think it's Job 38, where they're existent at creation. And
could be a double reference, right? Like an all-encompassing reference where it's both and, maybe.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think occasionally it's used that way. I think the reason that it's used for human rulers is because of the ancient Near East just sort of accepted cultural reference that rulers are divine, right? And like so it's using it that way on occasion, but the reason it's using it that way is because everybody in that worldview would have assumed, oh, of course, rulers, it's a reference to divinity. That the distinction between those like spiritual beings, right, divine assembly beings or whatever, and humans, human rulers, gets blurred. That's the whole point of a lot of the ancient Near East cultists, where you're going up to high places and interacting with these gods. I mean, the Japanese emperor still has a ceremony where he's supposed to unify with a divine being at the beginning of his rule. So this is, I mean, throughout human history, I think this is the predominant take on what makes rulers rule.
Right. I come from a long background of doing Jewish outreach and apologetics. So what I've kind of discerned is like Son of God is more a kingly title, like, and Son of Man is more the divine title in Scripture, and Son of God was a common, ancient Near East title for a ruler, right? There was a something divine, they merge the there's no separation of church and state basically in ancient times. So, yeah, no, that's good. So, let's get a little bit into your film. So I saw in the trailer there was some UFO stuff, but the thing that I guess fascinated me the most, one of the things I saw in my UFO research was a connection to the occult, excuse me, and paranormal, where it follows family lines. So it seemed like there was an element of that, and I don't know how much of a focus that is in your film, that there's a connection there where I know a lot of Christians who I've heard that a lot from Christians who work in this space. I don't know what to call this, but I don't want to call it spiritual warfare because that's a very large term, and I think you can face spiritual warfare without it being overtly manifest in paranormal ways. But if you could speak to that.
Yeah. So the series that I'm working on is 6 episodes, and in the first episode we really just get to teasing kind of the family history, and the reason for that is we didn't know about it until we got to speak with Kristen's mother, and there are elements of it that Kristen didn't know about, I don't think, until we sat down with Kristen's mom. We kind of had their, several members of their extended family there recording a conversation. And so there is a being that Kristen endeavored in her practice to conjure and interact with and pay homage to.
Never a good idea.
Yeah. And that being has a particular name, and unbeknownst to Kristen, her uncle had practiced witchcraft with a transvestite at the time. I think they didn't even have the language for transgender, but whatever, a man that was playing the woman, and demanded to be called by the name of this entity. Kristen didn't know that until we found it out, I think. And
so it was like he was a medium or something?
I don't think he claimed to be that. They would practice some form of eclectic witchcraft. I wasn't able to nail down. I've got several of the accoutrements, I guess, that were in that practice, but I don't know whether I don't know what that person's background was.
Okay.
I know them by reputation, but I haven't been able to find that individual. And I know, several people have attested to his presence with Kristen's uncle doing these rituals. And then Kristen's uncle also exhibited the same sort of symptoms, we would say, I guess, of possession, wanting to be in the dark all the time, blacking the windows out, never coming out except for bare biological needs, violent outbursts, that kind of thing, and had undergone once or twice sort of a backwoods attempt at an exorcism, from how it was described to me.
What does that mean, like a non-Christian exorcism?
No, I think they were Christians. It's just in Appalachia, there are different. There's a lot of charismatics and that kind of.
Okay.
So one that had ended up in like a pushing wrestling match in the house. And some other stuff. And he had admitted to having some nefarious plans that they were then able to go and look and confirm that he was planning to do some crazy stuff that he admitted to. And he had been admitted to the psychiatric hospital on a couple of occasions with schizophrenia. So that was the end result after the exorcism attempt. Is he was sent to the hospital, came back months later, sort of the same thing happens again later.
This is the exorcist who's sent to the hospital, or
no, the uncle, Kristen's
oh,
uncle.
the uncle. Okay.
But I say all that, like, we get into it in the documentary and a lot more.
Sure,
detail.
I don't want to give everything away, but yeah.
Well, I don't so much care about that as the time to explain it.
Yeah.
But my point is just, so that's one generation prior to Kristen. And then what would be Kristen's grandfather had some similar, like, very weird behavior and experiences with manifestations of the spiritual that at one point he was, like, pushed down stairs, resulting in a compound fracture, which he blamed on them. So anyway, for generations, at least 3 of them, this family has had a lot of strangeness.
Yeah, I guess the grandfather is not alive anymore.
No.
So you couldn't, like, so you might have been able to trace it back further than the grandfather if you had access to the grandfather. Okay.
Yeah, and that Kristen's mother's generation, there were like 16 children in that family.
Whoa.
And nice. Every one of them that I've been able to talk to has had similar strange experiences involving seeing shadow figures, which they're like 2 or 3, and they describe them similarly, and then witnessing very large, like biologically impossibly large birds, so thunderbirds basically, and
not the car.
No, yeah, like birds the size of planes, that kind of thing.
Oh, like a small airplane or something like that?
Yes. Yeah, birds that size.
That is unusually large. So it's not like a bald eagle they mistook or something, or
no, they're talking like vehicle sized.
Whoa.
Which, if you recall from Mothman Prophecies, was an accompanying phenomenon that was reported during the Mothman flap.
I didn't read that yet.
Okay, yeah.
Even though I remember, for John Keel, I read his Operation Trojan Horse.
Yeah. Yeah. So Mothman Prophecies, I believe, is before that, and it's
67 or something like that.
Yeah. So the Thunderbird thing, or interactions with owls that are strange. So one of the interesting things about that is the being that Kristen was intending to conjure and interact with is depicted flanked by owls. What's kind of a marker of hers.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so it's a lot of strangeness, but it's an inductive sort of, like a mosaic of evidence, I guess, rather than a deductive case for this is what's going on. But I think that's how the paranormal is in general. I don't think you very often get a deductive case to be made. I think it has to be inductive. But
no, that's true. And one of the other things I've kind of noticed, and I think I picked this up from Keel, was that these entities are deceptive in nature. And it seems like they're you mentioned a resource I hadn't heard before, but from a book about 20 years ago, I guess, but that they're intentional. They're almost like always out of reach, like just out of reach. Like the eyewitnesses will see stuff and then they'll go chase down the Bigfoot footprints, and then they'll stop in the middle of nowhere, or and don't continue anywhere, and that sort of thing. And I think it's almost like they're intentionally trying to hook people who do the research, right? At least the ones not coming from a Christian perspective, where it almost becomes like a drug, like you're chasing that fix, if that makes sense. Or I'm this close to getting proof, like, or I'm this, maybe in, folklore is like, I'm this close to like finding the buried treasure, and I spend the rest of my life, chasing that rabbit hole, like the National Treasure movie or something like that.
Yeah. That one of the apparently, so I'm relatively new to studying this stuff, but one of the gentlemen that whose experience I drew on was a paranormal investigator for 14 years and a practicing occultist at one point, who has since converted. And that he described the same thing, that it's that feeling of tapping into the secret knowledge or detecting kind of the undercurrent that runs under reality. That feeling is addictive, and it becomes an obsession, much like a drug addiction. And he would use the phrase demonically obsessed. And I think that you can see that if you take, who Zach Baggins is?
No.
So he runs a real popular TV paranormal show. I think it's called Ghost Adventures. But he also made a film called Demon House, where he purchased a home that was infamously site of demonic activity.
Yeah, I heard about that on the Through the Black channel, the YouTube channel I mentioned. You should hook up with those guys.
Yeah. So I think you can see going on in his life, to whatever degree he's not just acting, and I don't know the man, so I don't want to. I'm not saying that he's lying. I don't know, but I think you can see that obsession factor in a pretty stark way in his life, and I think that's a pretty good example of what it looks like and how it takes people. And honestly, I have since repented of this, but I sort of as a joke, when we were down there shooting, we were in a house that was supposed to be haunted the first night we were there. And we had gone through and shot a bunch of stuff, and there were some objects that we found in the house that were weird. And I had been, watching Hellier, where they use, it's called the Secret Cipher of the Euphonauts, which is a cipher that Alan Greenfield popularized. And anyway, I plugged some of the names of those objects into this cipher as a joke. And I told one of the people that was working on it, one of the results that came up was hold bear. And just as a joke, we were talking about cave and mine entrances, and I said, "Oh, this says hold bear. You better not, might not want to go in any mines." Haha. And that was the end of it that night. And then Friday, we went to the house that Kristen's mother lived in 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the people in that house invited us in and talked to us, and they reported a lot of the same crazy haunting stuff. The patriarch of that house had been pushed down the same set of steps that Kristen's grandfather had been, resulting in a compound fracture. And we shot, we interviewed. It was a very hectic and chaotic thing there at that house. We get back, and that's a long story, but 4 days later, I was going through the footage back here, and it occurred to me that I started looking through the footage, and every animal decoration in that home is a bear. And the first thing that my camera sees when I turn it on inside the front door is a set of 4 bears. One has a sign, is holding a sign that says welcome, and the third one is holding a sign that says go away. And then like every wall populated by bear figurines, bear statues, teddy bears, bear print upstairs in like an upstairs hallway was piled up with giant teddy bears like to my chest level.
You just didn't notice that when you were there? It just didn't occur to you until you saw it on film?
Right, because it had been 5 days of interviewing people, and I had moved well on from, this throwaway hold bear joke. And I didn't even, I think somebody else that was in the chat where I had mentioned that brought it up when I looking at the footage. So, but I say all that to say that like that, I can see where that feeling of like knowing something too early or knowing some secret thing is real addictive. Like that goosebumpy kind of, I've touched the current under reality.
I
can see where that
just a dark reality, right?
Yeah, I can see where that would turn into an obsession like quickly, particularly if you didn't understand, if you didn't have the Christian worldview in those categories. I can see where you could become an occultist real quick that way.
Well, hidden knowledge is always seductive, right? That Gnosticism, like the first Christian heresy, or I guess maybe after Judaizers. It was all in that, secret society sort of stuff. We know something other people don't. Is very, very seductive. Now, did anything else happen to you? Besides that, were there anything weird that was occurring to you? Because I remember, and now John Keel wasn't a Christian, but I remember in his Operation Trojan Horse book, he had all sorts of like poltergeist stuff happen to him while he was investigating the UFO stuff, and he even had like a Men in Black sort of incident. So I'm not saying at that level, but I was wondering if the demonic knew you were on the case, if you started experiencing things.
So very little, I think, while I've been back. I've had a couple incidents where like I was on the phone at one point discussing some of the like interesting numerological patterns that showed up in different places and had some stuff like knocked off a table here. And that's happened a time or two. But I think that my personality is such that if there's been anything like that, it's mostly been in like heavy discouragement that the product isn't good, it isn't worthwhile, that I'm saying something crazy or wrong, or that I've had one.
But nothing overt, you're saying?
Not while I've been back here. So there was one instance while we were there, after we got back from that house. We sat down with everyone and kind of the family there and debriefed, I guess. One of them was too frightened to go in the home. But we were just talking about how repetitive that was, and reading a bit of scripture about this entity in Psalm 91 and Isaiah 34, and sort of anyway, we finished the conversation, and I wanted to get some footage of Kristen's tattoos. She has a tattoo sleeve on one arm, a partial sleeve, I guess, and so she went upstairs to change into a sleeveless shirt so we could shoot footage of the tattoos. She came back down and we shot for 3 or 4 minutes. And I was commenting on how several of her tattoos are a conscious homage to this entity. So she has the triple moon tattoo on the inside of her forearm, which is a common daughter, mother, crone like the phases of a witch's life, and it's also an homage to the night goddess, which is this being, or related to it, the archetype anyway. And she had several tattoos anyway that referenced that. And I was commenting as I put the camera away, I think, on how the fact that, you know, this idea of we are trophies of the grace of God, right? We are trophies of Christ's grace, in that he would save sinners like us. And I commented on the fact that as a trophy, you know, carrying the actual marks of this other fallen deity must anger that other deity, because Jesus came in and pillaged her stuff, right? Jesus stole the person that she had. And anyway, that conversation lasted about 4 minutes from the time that she came downstairs and we're having that conversation. I'm packing the camera up and I hear in the hallway somebody scream. And so throughout this thing, like every time that I get done, that's when something happens, when I'm putting stuff away.
Oh, so you can't have proof of it or whatever, right? Yeah.
So I put the camera back together as fast as I can, and I run out into the hallway, and from the light fixture in the hallway, there's water pouring. And it's standing in the hallway, like a couple inches deep in the hall. We run upstairs. I follow Kristen and I believe her mom up the stairs to go see where the source of the water is coming from. I hear a door slam as we run up the stairs. I ran past that door that slammed because I was trying to find where the water was, but apparently that door slammed without anybody doing it. We tried to recreate it by sprinting past it and couldn't. There was no window open inside. The kids were inside watching TV with the window closed. They thought we slammed it. We thought they slammed it. Continued down. The bathroom was full of 3 or 4 inches deep standing water. There was no leak that we could find. There was no source of water. Ran back downstairs. Outside, it's pouring down the siding outside. I mean, it's run through the floor joists, obviously, between the bathroom and the outside. And it's standing in the closet downstairs in the hallway, and everyone's scrambling around trying to find anything to soak up water. I'm trying to get a read on Derek, the owner of the home, is standing there with a shocked look on his, like, because there's no explanation for where the water came from.
Oh, is Derek related to
brother-in-law? So
brother-in-law. Okay.
Yeah. Derek is married to Misty. Misty is Kristen's sister.
Oh, okay.
And they're in the film. I interviewed them as well. So yeah, I would say that was kind of the most dramatic sort of experience. And it turns out that day, I didn't know this at the time, but that was November 27th, 2020. That day is astrologically significant. In that month, it is the lunar apogee, which is referred to as the Black Moon Lilith. Lilith being the name of the entity that Kristen paid homage to, and also the name that the transgender, transvestite, whatever, witch wanted to be referred to as. That's
also the name of the in Jewish Kabbalah, right?
Yep. So the Kabbalistic myth of Lilith is the more recent take, and this is usually what Wiccans and witches are consciously referring to when they worship her. The idea in the Kabbalah is that Lilith was Adam's first wife who refused to submit and joined the Nakash, joined the dragon in rebellion, and so was written out of Genesis. That's the more recent take. But that name, Lilith or Lilith, in Hebrew, is taken from a reference to a Mesopotamian night demon who was responsible for sudden infant death syndrome and also referred to as like a wind demon, so like windstorms and stuff. The idea being that it stole the breath from the children.
My Italian heritage would say those are cats.
Yeah.
That steal the breath, but yeah.
And so that being is referenced in Scripture. In Isaiah 34, some translations have it night owl, screech owl, that kind of thing, but it's literally Lelit. And then in Psalm 91, the reference to terror of the night, or it's sometimes rendered screech owl, is an idiomatic reference to the Lelit, Lilitu, or Lilu. They're all related words in like Mesopotamia. And the first literary reference to that being is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it's been it's like a constant archetype throughout history. And I think that the case that the doc series makes is not that there's a deity named Lilith that, you know, Krishna is worshiping and Lilith possessed her and Lilith did all these things. I think, you know, looking at this with kind of a hybrid, baptizing John Keel and looking at it through a Christian worldview. As you say, those things are deceptive. That trickster element is constant, and you never know if the thing on the other side is representing itself accurately. And so what I think we can say, or what I'm making the case for, I guess, in the series, is that it appears that there's a thing behaving according to an archetype that has a name, for whatever reason, possibly just because it's effective deception and effective at gaining worship, but it's behaving according to that archetype. And you know, accompanied by a lot of the markers. So when we take our experience to Scripture and say, okay, where is this Lilith referenced, and what are the things that are accompanying it, and we experience all those things. Like you start reading in Isaiah 34:14 and following, and you've got flocks of carrion eaters as an accompanying thing. When God's cursing Babylon and saying that he'll make it a residence for demons, one of which is Lilith, things that accompany it, every one of those things in some way shows up in this case. And so, you know, I think at some point the pattern becomes strong enough or significant enough that I'm at least comfortable saying it appears that there's something behaving according to an archetype that has a name.
Right. Now you're saying that I saw in the trailer there was accompanying UFO sightings. Is that true?
So not in this case, but it's interesting that
in the area, was it?
Yeah, in the area. And then the interesting thing about the area is, how much do you know about like Chief Cornstalk and the Point Pleasant mythos behind Mothman?
I don't. I know that there's certain areas that have more paranormal activity than others for reasons beyond my understanding.
Right. Okay. So the Native Americans that we are familiar with, which are of course later it's controversial, but seem like our later civilizations than the cultures that built the mounds and the effigy mounds and the burial mounds.
They took over from previous tribes or something like that.
Yes.
So the mounds are built by previous tribes and okay, I think I know where you're going with this, but I'll let you go with it.
So the Native American tribes that we're familiar with, the later ones, would not live in the Point Pleasant region because it's the conjunction of rivers And mixed waters are it's like crossroads in hoodoo or magic practice. It's where worlds interact, worlds cross. So they wouldn't live there. They would hunt there. They wouldn't live there. Chief Cornstalk, legend has it, or just history has it, was murdered along with his, I think, eldest son at a fort in Point Pleasant. I think it was actually across the river in Ohio, but basically, Point Pleasant's right there on the river across from Gallipolis. But Chief Cornstalk was murdered, and legend has it that as he was murdered, he spoke a curse. And so the area has been under the curse of Chief Cornstalk. A lot of people tie that to the presence of the Mothman, which was then a harbinger in folklore for the collapse of the Silver Bridge in, I believe, 67. Accompanying all of the Mothman sightings was what you'd refer to as a flap or a spike in UFO sightings.
Yes.
So heavy that it was predictable, according to Keel and journalists at the time, where people could, they would make it a thing. They would go up and watch the UFOs. And so that was Point Pleasant. Logan, West Virginia, which is maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours away. I'd have to look on a map to be certain, but it's something like that. Also had some UFO activity at the time, and also following more in the 80s. But Logan was originally named Aracoma after the daughter of Chief Cornstalk, who is buried there, Princess Aracoma. We say princess. That's not the Native American term. Is more accurately like great woman or wise woman or something. But Aracoma was the daughter of Chief Cornstalk, was buried in Logan, and Logan was originally named for her. When they bulldozed, the Aracoma Hotel in Logan was built on that burial site. It burned down, I think, in the 20s, and when they bulldozed it, they discovered beneath it all of these Native American remains, like 50 plus bodies, on one of whom they assumed was Aracoma, but one of them was a child who bore a necklace with a gorget that depicted a birdman. Okay, so half bird, half man, Mothman. And also that idea of the half bird, half man is a common demigod in Native American religion, cults practice. So there's this tie of, there's that tie. Also, one of the first things that we heard when we were down there at the first house we went to, that aside from this, I did not understand how it connected to anything. But we were at this house that was supposed to be haunted, where we found some of the objects. And right as I was getting ready to go, again, packing up everything, the lady says, who lives kind of down the holler from the house, but her family owned the house. She says, "Oh, one more thing. She was talking to somebody else in the room. Do you remember that giant bird?" And then she relates a story where the person who lived there at the house that was supposed to be haunted apparently witnessed a giant owl landed in the yard. Now, this house isn't really tied to Kristen or Kristen's family. It's just geographically in the same place. And then they made the connection to the Mothman thing. They said, what year was that? Was that near the Mothman flap? Could it have been Mothman? She had never heard of Mothman. So anyway, there's a lot of there are some connections like that that are very tenuous, but I think they're interesting nonetheless as they start to pile up, I guess.
Yeah, the Keel mentions that the stuff goes around, and I'm currently reading a book on Bigfoot, That's very much in the vein of Keel and Valais, called Where the Footprints End, or something like that.
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
It's very good, and I hope to reach out to the author sometime. They're not writing from a Christian perspective, as far as I can tell, but there's a lot of stuff that coincide, right? Like Bigfoot's have a lot of similarities with poltergeist activity, and you see a lot of UFOs in the same areas where you see Bigfoot and stuff like that. So, and also the finding Bigfoot, you have evidence, but then you never get there, right? You never get absolute proof. Like you're being teased. A question about the family in question, or maybe just the area in Appalachia. So I guess there's not much of a native culture left, like a Native American culture left. So in the area of Appalachia, I know they originally are like mainly Scots-Irish or something like that. Their occultic practices in that region, do they derive from the natives that they encountered originally, or is it stuff they brought with them from the old world?
So it's an amalgamation. Everything is, or the most common is very eclectic, what you'd call Appalachian folk magic.
Like old traditional European beliefs combined with traditional Native American beliefs.
Yeah, I think most of the surviving, as far as practice, is Celtic. But this family has a lot of Native American blood in their family. So I believe it would be Kristen's, I think, great-grandmother was a full-blooded Native American woman. And you can, like, they have that, like, very nice skin, very straight black hair, like, you can tell. And there are interesting crossovers in the practice, like the burning of sage is a common, like, Native American practice as well. So
is that an occultic practice, or just like?
Well, it's to cleanse an area or a person of evil spirits. So it's
occultic, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, it's light, and a lot of people do it without
thinking.
Yeah. It's like Wicca, like people are messing with stuff, but they're probably, it's on the dabbling end, and it usually leads to, it leads to more. But it's on the level of, like, wearing a crystal around your neck, that kind of thing. But what is interesting about that is there's a controversial archaeological position that the Celts predate what we think the later generation Native Americans in that region, because there are actually Celtic. Well, there are petroglyphs that appear to have Celtic rune carvings in them. That predate the later Native American tribes.
What are they dated to?
I'd have to look.
Is it before or after European settlers?
Prior. Way prior.
That's weird.
Yeah.
So essentially they would have to have a common ancestor or a common spiritual entity influencing both, right?
Yeah. Well, and
right. That could be your two options there. Is that it's beliefs carried over from some common, whatever, 8,000-year-old source, before an ice age, or.
Yep. Are you familiar with the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio?
No.
Talk about a rabbit hole. I don't know how much you want to get into this, but there is.
I'm here for this.
There is an effigy mound. So an effigy mound is opposed to just a burial mound, which are more common than we think. There are many that aren't marked. and appear pretty much as you would expect. It's a mound. It's a dome. But effigy mounds depict discernible images from the air. The Great Serpent Mound is in Ohio, and it's a depiction of a coiled, or an uncoiling, I guess, serpent with an open mouth, and in the jaws of the serpent are depicted either an egg or a seed. So it's a serpent eating a seed. You can't see from anywhere on the ground, you cannot see what's depicted. You can only see it from the air. The head of the snake that's eating the seed aligns with the sun at summer solstice. So you have a limited number of satisfying explanations for why that is. And I'm sure some of them are occurring to you that occurred to me and have occurred to other people. This isn't, this is nothing original to me. Mm-hmm. But those were created by a civilization that predated the Native Americans we think of, what we refer to as Adena or Hopewell. But those names are not their names. Those are just names that we gave them because we happen to have found them on, the Hopewell farm or whatever.
Right. They didn't have written language, so we don't know what they call themselves, that sort of thing.
Yeah, at least not existing, right? And then you start to look at other structures that predate the Native American culture that could be attributed to a previous culture. And there's all kinds of astrological alignments and alignments with other super ancient structures. So, for instance, there's one called America's Stonehenge, I think it's in New Hampshire, that has a clear delineation, like one of the standing stones and the center of the structure make a line that runs straight through one of the gates at Stonehenge in Britain. It has other lines that point to places like the Newark earthworks, which are, again, an effigy mound. This one's not it's not as easy to figure out what it's representing. There's an octagon, there's a circle, there's like between. But if you start drawing lines from the center of those structures out, like the 8 points of the octagon, or out different, lining up different structures within that earthworks, one of them points to the Great Serpent Mound. One of them points to like ziggurats in South America and other ancient giant stone structures like Machu Picchu and that kind of thing. Then you begin to ask, where did the astrological information come from, and where did the ability to plot a line that happens to fall on those other sites come from? Right, like now this has radically changed, I guess, my conception of what ancient history looked like.
Or why would they even, even if you said it was a spiritual entity directing that, why would they even want to?
Well,
I guess you can't answer that, right?
The easiest one to guess at is a serpent eating a seed. Mm-hmm. That's Genesis 3:15 inverted, right? The seed crushed the head of the serpent.
Yeah, okay.
It's a depiction of the opposite thing happening. Whether it's an egg or a seed, right? An egg is a seed. It's a depiction of the inverse of that. And then you go look at the prevalence of seraphim worship in multiple cultures in the ancient world. So the worship of the winged serpent is everywhere. So I think it changes how much you think happens prior to the flood.
Yeah. No, that's weird. That is definitely a rabbit hole. I don't know if I want to go down that. I'm already in Bigfoot. I was not expecting to be in Bigfoot a year ago,
I know. 2 years ago, if I had heard myself say any of the things that I've said on any of these podcast appearances or in the film itself, this was not in the plan, in my plan.
How much time do you have?
I could go maybe another half hour or so.
Okay. I want to maybe wrap this up, and then I want to maybe do a bonus episode on Missing 411. Get your opinion on that. You mentioned you had opinions on that, and I'm sure we could keep talking for hours or something like that. All right. So what do we want to say to folks where we were, I don't know, 5 years ago? Think your average Reformed Baptist, your PCA, your OPC guy, not your crazy charismatic. No offense, my charismatic brothers, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Maybe people like me who were burned by the charismatic movement, and you're smoking because you have a demon of tobacco or that sort of thing, and maybe speak to those people about not just what's going on. I one guy you might want to look into. He is a Lutheran guy who wrote a book called "I'm Not Afraid." He had a series of interviews where he witnessed an exorcism in Madagascar, and then it kind of like there's a bunch of spiritual stuff going on in Madagascar or something like that. I believe it was Madagascar or Mozambique or something like that. And I called up and asked, and this was years ago, and maybe this is one of my turning points to think about this stuff, looking back on it, was like, so why do you see this so much overt activity in say this African culture, but not in the West? Maybe we do see some of it in the West now. And he said it was like his speculation, which I think made sense, and he might not remember it because this was like an answer to a telephone call, was that kind of the way I would interpret what he said was, if you're asleep and you're under materialism, why wake you up? Right? You're in materialism. Why do a bunch of strange things to wake you up? That materialism is false. So, but in cultures where that's not the case, you see more of this. So if you could speak to those two things, like what's going on, what should we take away from it? The people the Christians who aren't familiar with this sort of thing, just maybe we can have a little back and forth, and if you just want to go with that.
Okay, so I think to speak to where I was 5 years ago, you would have to make the biblical case that I wasn't aware of at the time. And I would say that the key, I think, to that is reading Genesis 6 in light of Job 38, and Psalm 82 in light of Psalm 89, and probably Genesis 10 in light of Deuteronomy 32, or the other way around. I won't try to make that case because it takes time, but
that's fine. The reference you gave, the references, and
I think that one of the things that makes sense of geographical differences in this stuff is, one, what you said. And you'll notice that in our culture, the paranormal stuff that does happen appeals to the people who are necessarily kind of more spiritually bent. Okay, so New Age types. You look what effect the UFO phenomenon is having with CE5 and Stephen Greer, and that's going to attract spiritual types, right? People finding materialism to be unsatisfactory to their inner life, which eventually will be everybody, but people that are now like looking for more, looking for some higher consciousness, higher spiritual connection. You've got the UFO phenomenon here. But I think you're right. It's not going to be as demonstrable or as explicit here as it is in third world countries where materialism is not the order of the day. The other thing is, again, looking at Genesis 10, Deuteronomy 32, is I believe that there are different time and place has some effect on both sides of this veil, on both sides of the material, spiritual, dimensional distinction. Geography and time have some kind of effect. You can see that in Daniel 10, where the angel of the Lord is prohibited or impeded in his progress by the Prince of Persia. So there's something geographical about it. And I think that makes sense when you go look at the Tower of Babel with Deuteronomy 32 and then Psalm 82 and Psalm 89. I think it's a cohesive case for there are what Paul refers to as principalities or rulers on the spiritual side that are geographically assigned, tied, and they may have different MOs or find different things effective at any given time.
Right. So the demons in Washington, D.C. worked in Vegas worked differently than Appalachia.
Yeah. Whatever principality is whispering in the ears of power is probably much more subtle than the demon that's running around doing spook stuff, or the elemental spirits that are just doing trickster things out in the woods in Appalachia. So
they got bigger fish to fry. They got yeah. From a earthly I gotcha.
Yeah, they got big moves, geopolitical moves.
Right, yeah.
And those entities, I think you can make the case from scripture again that those entities aren't the same thing. Like we tend to this is again another rabbit hole, but we tend to think of at most, if we think of supernatural as modern Christians, we think of God and then good angels and bad angels, and Satan is just a big bad angel. But there's more than that. There's more taxonomy than that in scripture. And there's no reason to think that, knowing how diverse God created beings in the material realm, there's no reason to assume that there's less diversity on the other side. So we don't know. There may be things even beyond what we're told, but we're told that there's more than just good angels, bad angels. So, in that vein,
and if you're taking Genesis 6 the way it is, that's opens up a whole other can of worms, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. If Bene Elohim in Genesis 6 refers to the same Bene Elohim in Job 38, which would appear to be the case as Jude quotes First Enoch, which is an apocryphal work. I'm not counting it as canonical, but Jude does quote it, and it did pre-exist Jude. We discovered it older manuscripts than Jude in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So
or First Enoch could like the Jewish understanding of the time or something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's all I would take it to be. Is representative of how Second Temple Judaism viewed the Mesopotamian like creation myth, because you cross-reference that with the basically all the Mesopotamian cultures had this idea that the gods had come down and given them technology, and that they were unique among civilizations because of that. And Enoch is the Jewish like rhetorical response to that ancient Near East mythos. But when Jude quotes it, and then possibly Peter references it, you're getting the idea that the guys who wrote the New Testament under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit didn't see fit to destroy that mythos. What they did was they placed it in context of these are rebellious members of God's initial kind of household that rebelled and fell and had dominion over the nations. And then when Christ dies and rises again, and he says, all authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. Therefore go do what? Not make disciples of people, but disciple the nations. Because the nations are no longer ruled by those divine assembly beings. Christ has destroyed their authority. All authority is now his. Therefore go tell the nations that their rulers are done. Their gods are dead. It's me now. So, and when Paul talks about Christ in his death was disarming the powers of darkness, putting them to an open shame. When Peter talks about Christ going and preaching to the spirits in prison, and basically saying my take on that would be, and this isn't original to me, again, this is Heiser, Doug Van Dorn, like, this is not me. But, Christ is saying to those the fallen beings imprisoned here, cast down on earth, all your stuff is mine now. All the nations belong to me. And that's, I think it radically increases the scope of what's going on in Christ's victory on the cross. Like, it doesn't, penal substitutionary atonement is inescapable, I think, for Christians. And I know that there are Christians who deny that phrasing, but, that is true. But I think there's also a significant part of the atonement that is Christus Victor, that is, Christ.
Yeah. The problem, the people who deny penal substitutionary atonement point to everything else, but it's like, I don't understand why it can't have multiple aspects. Right? Yeah.
Yes. That I.
So what's going? Getting back to more of the. I guess we're seeing a spike and taking this seriously. We're UFOs and other stuff. What's going on? Do you have any theories, or like, what should the average person in the pew, maybe everybody on my channel is probably of a more reformed bent, or Lutheran, or not the snake handlers, quote unquote.
Yeah.
What should we how should we think of this, or what's going on? What should, in terms of what's going on in ministry? What should we be thinking, I guess? What are our takeaways from either your film or just all this high strangeness stuff in general?
I think, so two main things. One, I think that there are people, and I have met them, that were experiencing this stuff, and the church had no answer other than psychology for them. And I think that dealing in this realm, the realm of the spiritual and the realm of the supernatural, ought to be the birthright of the church, because all authority belongs to Christ. And where do you go to find Christ in time and space here on earth? You go to the church, right? And so if
the seminaries aren't really
right,
having classes on like Bigfoot sightings, that's not in the manual. Like, hey, some objects have been knocked over in my house, and there's knocks and stuff, and I come from a long line of like people who dabbled in the occult, pastor,
I met a guy like that. One of the podcasts that I did was with a guy who grew up, I think he grew up Catholic and then went Southern Baptist, but his family had dabbled in the occult for generations, and I think that he didn't come out and say this because I was trying not to argue or debate or push him really, but I think that probably the church had no answer for that. And which is sad, because again, that should be our birthright as Christians, ought to be authority in this area.
What would be the answer? Would be, I assume, repentance. What would you do exorcism prayer wise? Like, how would you address, like, say it, you had someone who came from a long line of stuff. They're seeing, the dark people or whatever, the shadow people, something like that. Like what would be not that you're a pastor, but what would be your pastoral advice if you had to give pastoral advice?
Right. So,
like, how do you handle the situation? Like, someone has a poltergeist, someone's seen shadow beings, that sort of thing.
So, again, as you say, I am not a pastor.
Right.
And I'm also, fairly new to studying this stuff. So I can give you what my pastor friend who conducted this exorcism in our series, I can give you what he says. And I think this is a very good metric. So if someone comes and reports that kind of thing, mental health is absolutely a thing that you need to check on. So have you had a talk with a counselor and had sort of a mental health evaluation? And hopefully that counselor shares the Christian worldview. If so, then you also want, a physical checkup. Like, how are you doing? And those are baseline at sort of the same time you start praying. Because the fact is that there could be people for whom it's entirely chemical or it's entirely material. There could be people for whom it's entirely spiritual. There could be people for whom one feeds the other. And so
like a demon could cause you to go crazy or something like that, or
right.
And so you're interpreting everything as, this thing's bothering me when it's not, it's a mixture of the two.
Right. So I think you have to be epistemologically honest about what you can know, but you can't write off that spiritual beings are real. So, it's all rather than drawing a hard distinction between the mechanical, physical reality and then the spiritual realm, it's all just the world that God created. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So,
which is a seen and an unseen aspect.
Yeah, right. There are things that you perceive with your eyes, and there are things you perceive other ways, and there are things that are beyond your perception. All that's true. So, you want to eliminate as much as you can early on. So let's get mental health, physical checkup. Let's make sure that stuff is not an obvious answer. And if not, then the answer is prayer and the pleading the blood and the name of Jesus Christ. So this sounds charismatic, but I think this is what Luther said to do when encountering spiritual forces, was this is Jesus's house. And the assertion of Christ's authority is the only answer that we have. There's nothing in your personal charisma or willpower or knowledge that's going to do anything for you. Like, it's the name of Christ. And you have odd well, not odd to us, right? But odd to alien people, they're alien believers, where abductions are stopped on occasion by invoking the name of Christ.
That's also mentioned in the Bigfoot book I mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that that's the only answer that I have. That's the only answer I think that there is, because you're dealing with something that's very, very old, and irrespective of how intelligent the thing is or what kind of thing it is, by virtue of being on the other side, it necessarily can see things differently. So
you would assume it's smarter and more powerful than you.
Yeah, or at least has a lot more experience.
Right. So don't rely on yourself.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
whatever you do, I would recommend not communicating.
No. Yeah,
right, don't talk to it or whatever, just in the name of Jesus leave or something like that.
Yeah. And that's even as from our perspective, as like kind of out there as the Warrens were, like that was boiled down, that was their advice too. Even though they would engage with what they thought were human spirits, which I think is not a good idea.
No.
At bottom, that's what they advised. And yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, let's wrap up this portion. I'll edit, and then we'll have a little 10 or so minute segment on the missing 411 thing. Give me the details of where your thing will be. And
yeah, so we'll be on lure.tv. It's a new streaming startup. They optioned the series about a few months ago. So LOOR.tv.
Is it free, paid, or
it'll be a subscription service? Their model is really interesting. They're trying to be a haven for projects that would not make it on Netflix because of worldview issues. So can't touch with that kind of thing. So as a result of that, there's there'll probably be some pretty wild and possibly offensive stuff on there, but it's a bastion for Christian filmmakers that would be canceled anywhere else. And so lure.tv, LOOR.tv. The film's website is darkhollerfilm.com. And then our social stuff is at Dark Holler Film on Facebook and Instagram.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to edit it here and stay tuned for our bonus episode.